Hey, Internet, and welcome to episode 2 of the Neoncast, the podcast that's just like every other podcast, except that I'm on it. Coming to you from Storm Central in our nation's capital. I'm currently buried in a snow heap, so I figured why not make another one of these things. I got a lot of pretty good responses for last week's Neoncast. I got a lot of tweets, got some nice YouTube comments. I guess people kind of dug it, which is awesome, I guess. Makes me want to do more of these. I'm trying to break out some of my better gear that's been stowed away for a while since my audio days. Expect some additional improvements in the coming future. So I figured I might start this out by talking about a few comments that I got on the topics that I discussed last show. So first of all, I got a nice YouTube comment from Slider954, whom I also know on Twitter, and he sent me something about 10 Cloverfield Lane. Apparently, there was some Reddit thread that had information about it, about how it was not really a Cloverfield movie, and that it was retconned into being a Cloverfield project. And it had a lot of info about it, but then I saw a bunch of tweets by Peter Scaretta, I believe that's his name, the guy who runs Slash Film, and he said that he knows that all of that is false. I mean, he says, I don't know much about 10 Cloverfield Lane, but I do know that everything about that Reddit post is false. And then he goes into a bunch of details about that, and apparently it's not true, and it's not that it started its life as something completely unrelated, and then someone came along and was like, hey, why don't we make this more Cloverfield? Because that does happen. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a good example of this, but this has happened before, where a script, goes around Hollywood and it's pretty good, but it doesn't have like a crutch to sell it. So someone goes like, hey, why don't we make this a name franchise X? And they kind of shoehorn it to be related to some franchise or other. But apparently that's not the case with this. Another good comment I got was from Greg Butera on Twitter about Avatar. And he said something that I hadn't considered yet regarding the Avatar sequels. He said, if it hadn't been for Terminator 2, I don't think that anybody would have given a shit about the Terminator franchise. I mean, it took the sequel to turn it into an iconic franchise. These obviously people like the Terminator, but I think that it survives a lot in like retrospect as like the original, because Terminator 2 was such a gigantic film, and it's a good example because that's Cameron too. And I think he was kind of skeptical about Avatar's ability to repeat that kind of model, where the first one is kind of like, not a huge project, but then along comes the second one and kind of improves upon it. But I also don't know if that's a pretty appropriate comparison, considering that the first Terminator is actually good and the first Avatar is not good. But I mean, he does have a bit of a point there, in terms of like maybe waiting and seeing what happens with Avatar 2. Although it's now encountered a bit of a snag because it just came out that Episode 8, Star Wars Episode 8, has been pushed back from May of 2017 to December of 2017, which is when Avatar 2 was going to be released. And according to my friend, who I'm going to reference here a lot, and I'm going to call Piggy Bank, he knows a lot about the money aspect of movies and how these movies have to shuffle around in order to find a good slot so they can play for a certain number of weeks in IMAX, because that's where a lot of the money comes from. And the studios want to make as much money as they can for the first couple of 2 or 3 weeks, because then that's when they get the most money from the box office gross. So yeah, it's going to be kind of like a game of chicken to see who backs down first. It's probably going to be Avatar, although I don't know, James Cameron and his ego, and he invented the December tentpole thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's sad because I was happy that we would only have to wait like 18 months before we see episode 8, and now it's back to being like 2 years. Yeah, again, as long as they make it good, I'll give them a pass on that. So just make it good, guys, and you'll have no complaints from me. Anyway, on with this week's news. The Suicide Squad trailer aired this week, the full, number one first, because there was already some kind of teaser, but this was like the trailer for Suicide Squad came out, and it was pretty cool. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot of stake in Suicide Squad. I don't know a lot about the more expanded comic book universes, the DC universe, the Marvel universe. But I had a lot of fun with that trailer. I mean, I'm kind of looking forward to DC's sort of vision of a comic book world. It looks like they're going down a much crazier route than Marvel have, which is funny because Marvel has stuff like gigantic wormholes opening in New York and aliens streaming out and fucking Thanos and talking trees and space raccoons, and yet they keep it kind of grounded, if that makes sense at all. Whereas DC looks like they're all about like destroying entire cities and just going completely bananas, and I kind of like that because comic book worlds are insane. I mean, just look at Civil War, that's coming out soon. The comic story of Civil War, and again, this is something that I don't know well on my own. I've read about it. I've heard people who know talk about it. The Civil War storyline in the comic book is gigantic. It's epic in scale. There's 1 million superheroes in it and 1 million supervillains, and here it's more like Captain America and Iron Man, and they each have a few people on their team. Captain America has Bucky the Winter Soldier and Falcon and maybe like Black Widow, and Iron Man has like Vision and Scarlet Witch and Hawkeye. Like it's very small in scale, which I think works better for what Marvel do, but it is kind of subdued. They are kind of taking it down a little from the tone of the comics, whereas DC looks like they're just going all out and they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink. Batman and Superman has Wonder Woman, and it has it's going to have Aquaman, and it's going to have Cyborg, and it's going to have Apocalypse, and it's going to have Lex Luthor, and maybe the Joker, and it's going to it's going to have everything in it. And then Suicide Squad has all these villains that I don't really know, Deadshot and El Diablo. I'm going to make a complete fool of myself here because I don't know the names, but there's the guy who does the fire thing, and there's the guy who's the alligator thing, and there's the girl who's the witch thing, and then there's the samurai with the cursed sword thing, and then there's Harley Quinn and the Joker, and they're blowing up cities again, and there's monsters and aliens and magic, and that's cool. I really hope that it's a disaster in like the funnest way possible. And I also like the idea of sort of villains being the main focus. I think the one thing that the comic book, this stream of comic book projects that we have, a thing that it's missing and I think is slowly starting to seep in is tonal diversity. I think it's good, like Deadpool. I spoke about Deadpool last week, and now with the Suicide Squad thing, it has a kind of a different tone. They're both kind of cynical and a little darker in a sort of a gritty, sort of fun way. I was looking forward to Sinister Six, but that's now not happening, which sucks because Drew Goddard, he was supposed to make Daredevil, and then he was like, no, I'm going to do the Sinister Six project. But then that fell apart because Spider-Man went to Marvel, but then they might still do that if Spider-Man is a success, because supposedly Spider-Man's going to be in Civil War in a small role. The deal that brought Spider-Man to Marvel is very convoluted. I believe that Marvel makes all the money off of Spider-Man if he's in a Marvel movie, like if he appears in Civil War, if he then appears in, I don't know what's coming up, Infinity War, whatever. All the money from that goes to Marvel. If there's a Spider-Man movie, which there is going to be with Tom Holland, is that his name? Then all of that money goes to Sony, but it's being made by Marvel, I think. But Sony has full creative control. It's some kind of weird, like convoluted deal. But I do think that in the end of the day, the fans win out, because who cares who makes the money, who makes the decision? I mean, it's important who makes the creative decisions, just in the sense that you want the right people doing it, but as long as that happens, like as long as the right creative people take care of the project, doesn't really matter who, which millionaires make more millions of dollars off of it. But yeah, Suicide Squad looks very interesting. It looks fun. I like that it showed a lot, but also you still have no idea who the main antagonist is, what exactly the plot of the movie is. I think that unlike Batman v Superman, which had a trailer that showed way too much, here it actually there was a need to show a lot because nobody really knows anything about Suicide Squad. So it was good to show that, like, oh, this is going to have like big action set pieces. It's going to have a lot of like sort of funny, gritty-ish banter, and it's going to have the Joker running around. He's not part of the Suicide Squad, but he's kind of in the background, and it might kind of dovetail into Batman v Superman somehow, still unclear. And another thing I like is, and Marvel are doing this too, whereas in the first couple of Marvel phases, it was like, oh, we're going to have a Captain America movie, we're going to have a Iron Man movie, we're going to have a Thor movie, and then we're going to have an Avengers movie. And now it's kind of getting a little more complicated than that. I mean, they do have a bunch of like solo standalone movies coming, like Doctor Strange and Black Panther, Captain Marvel, I think, as well. But they also have Civil War, which is basically like a Captain America Iron Man movie. And then Thor Ragnarok is a Thor Hulk movie, because Hulk is not going to be in Civil War. He's going to be in Thor Ragnarok. So it's going to be like a combined Thor Hulk movie, sort of. And here we got Batman v Superman, and then we have Suicide Squad. And it's not like, oh, we're going to have a Joker movie and we're going to have a Batman movie. And again, those are going to happen. Like, there's going to be a Batman movie, and there's going to be a Wonder Woman movie and an Aquaman movie, but also they kind of combine them. It's not just like solo movie, Justice League, solo movie, Justice League. And the comics work like that too. They have all these crossovers, and they have these one-offs where like people combine, and that's cool. I think that's more interesting than just doing that sort of solo team. So yeah, Suicide Squad trailer. Check it out. It's pretty interesting. Sorry, drinking coffee. And along that lines, the Wonder Woman also had its first footage air. I didn't watch this, but DC had a whole thing on the CW because Legends of Tomorrow aired, and I don't really watch any of the TV comic-y things that are on, at least the Arrow, Flash, Gotham, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and now Legends of Tomorrow. Like, I don't watch any of that. I've seen the stuff that's on Netflix, but these aren't really my thing. But DC had this whole event where they spoke a lot about their upcoming projects, and they showed some footage and stuff, and they showed the first footage from Wonder Woman, which it came out recently, is going to take place during World War I, which I think is thumbs up. Like that a lot. Underutilized historical period. Everything's like World War II. Captain America was in World War II, the first one. I like the idea that's going to be in World War I because, again, Wonder Woman, I believe, is like some kind of immortal Amazon type thing. So it'll be interesting for us to get this this glimpse of her origin story, essentially. And that's coming out after Batman v Superman. So she's going to be in that movie in Dawn of Justice. Like, she's going to appear out of nowhere all of a sudden. Oh, look, it's Wonder Woman. And then later we're going to be like, well, here's what happened to her, years and years ago, back like in like World War I era, which I think is cool. Yeah, footage looks interesting, I guess. Looks like it'll have some cool action. Israel's own Gal Gadot, whom I've known since she was like Miss Israel years and years ago. She was like a beauty queen in Israel, and her career has really blown up after the Fast and the Furious movies. So yeah, good on her for being like the star of like a major superhero movie. So that's pretty cool, I think. And on that note, that's, I guess, the news that I wanted to discuss this week. I guess I could just mention, because I said that I might talk a little about anime, and I don't want to spoil this, but there's a show that's currently airing. If you don't know, I watch a lot of anime. I'm a really big anime fan, and I watch currently airing shows. And there's a show that's currently airing now. It's called Boku Dake ga Inai Machi. The English title is Erased, which is pretty simple to remember, and it is just amazing. It's the show everybody's talking about. Like, there's, I think, almost every season there's a show that like nobody can ignore, and everybody's talking about. And this season around, this is that. I mean, it's on pace to becoming like a real classic as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's just, some shows like are slow burns and like take a while to get going, and then by the end you're like, yeah, you know what, this kind of had a nice arc and some cool stuff happened. This really, from like the first minute, just grabs you, and it's so well made. Like, the direction is so great, and the art, and it really feels very cinematic in how it's put together. And I really don't want to say too much about it, but I'll be very, very brief, just because I think it's really cool to see without knowing anything. But I think I can just give away the first few minutes without it being terrible. It's about a guy. He's 29. He's kind of aimless. He works like as a pizza delivery guy. And he apparently has this weird ability. It's not exactly an ability, but every once in a while he finds himself like being jumped back a couple of minutes in time, so that he can stop some kind of bad thing from happening. It shows it in the thing, like he's on his little scooter delivering a pizza or whatever, and all of a sudden he has this intense sense of deja vu. He realizes he jumped back a couple of minutes, and he then looks around to see what the reason was that he got sent back. And then he sees that some truck driver fell asleep on the wheel, and then he tries to stop him, whatever. I'm not gonna explain a lot more than that, because I really think it's, I went into the show not knowing anything about it. It's based on a pretty popular manga. A lot of the fans of the manga are watching the people watching the anime and kind of smiling knowingly about what's about to come. But I basically watched this without knowing anything about it, and that was a big part of the fun. I also mentioned this last week in terms of 10 Cloverfield Lane and trailers and watching movies without knowing what they're about, and how that often can make reveals that are kind of minor into really interesting and shocking and cool things. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of you watch anime or casually watch it or whatever, but I would absolutely look this up if I were you. Yeah, Boku Dake ga Inai Machi, Erased. So I would absolutely seek that out if I were you. So that's it for this week's edition of things that I wrote down to talk about. And that's actually not true, because the main topic of this week's Neoncast is something that I wrote down, obviously, too. I'm not just winging this. I mean, I am winging it, but I'm winging it with the help of a little Post-it note with scribblings on it that I made at work one day. So yeah, moving along. So this week, I decided I would talk some more about science fiction, but on a slightly different topic. I started reading a very interesting science fiction novel called The Three-Body Problem by Liu Shiqian. I believe that's the way the name is pronounced. He's Chinese. Mandarin names, Chinese names are transcribed very oddly in English. The last name is spelled Cixin. And I actually spent a good 5 to 10 minutes on Wikipedia trying to figure out how to actually pronounce this, because Mandarin has a bunch of sounds that are unnatural to Western sort of speech. So Shiqian, I believe, is the pronunciation. Anyway, it's pretty acclaimed. It won the Hugo, and he's, I guess, China's premier sort of science fiction author. He's very popular, and I heard a lot about this book. I just finished reading The Void Trilogy by Peter F. Hamilton, who's a really good sort of interesting mix of hard sci-fi and also kind of epic scale sort of fantasy elements in space author. Very big fan of his. But I finished that and I was looking for something else, and I've been hearing about this three-body problem for a long time. So I picked it up and almost instantly noticed something that I notice in other media, which is that I really like stuff that's in genres that I appreciate, like science fiction, and also kind of sort of mind-bendy psychological thrillers and stuff like that come from other countries, what I would call in air quotes foreign fiction, because they always seem to have this different kind of perspective. It's not just where they're set, because obviously this novel is set in China, and the first part of it takes place in the 1960s during the communist cultural revolution in China, which in itself was a very interesting thing to read, and gave me some insight into stuff that I didn't really know. I know very little about the history of Chinese communism. I'm also very surprised that an author in China is allowed to speak of the Chinese Communist Revolution in quite these sort of harsh tones. He's clearly not a fan of what happened there. This also might be the result. I mean, I don't know if it's taboo to discuss, because again, I don't know the whole progression of how Chinese communism has evolved. So it might not be taboo to speak of that era in these kind of harsh tones. But it's not just that. It's not just that it's set in a place that I don't know and discusses historical events that I'm unaware of. But There's also, it's a translated novel, obviously, but it still retains its sort of Chinese flavor. The language is very Asian, and I say this actually as a big compliment. Again, I'm a huge consumer of Asian media. I'm a big fan of Korean film. I'm a big fan of anime, and also to a lesser extent Japanese film, and also stuff from China. Again, to a lesser extent, but even Hong Kong films and stuff of that nature. And it has this kind of, it's a little hard to explain. It's really something that you need to read to understand, but it's clearly not something written by an American or someone who's British. It has this kind of evocative language that's very interesting. And even when just discussing like regular things, like discussing somebody who's in prison and they're being interrogated and then they're being airlifted in a chopper to a military base, something that you could very easily read in an American, a British, or any other sort of Western language, and yet something about it is very sort of picturesque and uses very interesting imagery that you wouldn't expect. And I haven't even gotten to the meat of it yet, because apparently it's pretty epic and it goes into the future and aliens and all kinds of that crap. I'm not even there yet. I'm still in like the now of it. And already I'm pretty impressed, and so yeah, I wanted to give a few, I guess, more examples of this from my history as a media consumer. And I just mentioned Korean cinema. I've actually been on a bit of a tear of watching Korean movies lately. I've always been a fan of Korean cinema, and every time I watch another Korean movie, it really sort of cements my love for the film industry in Korea. I think it has a really impressive pool of talent, and some really strong voices. There's been an attempt to kind of to mine that for American cinema, both in terms of like taking Korean movies and remaking them, and also in terms of trying to bring Korean directors to make Western movies. Chan-wook Park, for instance, probably the most known Korean director sort of outside of Korea, who made Old Boy, which is probably one of the most famous sort of Korean movies for the Western audience. He made an American movie, Stoker, and also Old Boy was then remade horribly by Spike Lee. Another example is Snowpiercer, the movie that was made by Bong Joon-ho, who made a great Korean movie called The Host. It's like a Korean monster movie that's very interesting. So yeah, there's this increasing sort of growing fascination with the Korean sort of cinematic voices, and yeah, I watched a bunch of movies recently. I mean, I've been a big fan of Chan-wook Park for a long time, and his Vengeance trilogy, I think, is just a really, really impressive trio of movies. But also, I Saw the Devil is a movie I saw recently, and another really, really impressive sort of thriller, very violent, and very sort of very emotional. They really have the ability to kind of get you to truly hate the villains and really want horrible things to happen to them, and horrible things do happen to them, to the extent that it's even disturbing sometimes. But that's one of the interesting parts of it. Again, it's not just that the movies take place in Korea and have Korean things about them that maybe you didn't know and are maybe sort of new and interesting to you. Whereas if someone in Korea would have watched them, they'd be like, oh yeah, that's this thing and that's that thing. it's a voice. It's a different kind of voice. Things happen in it that you would never see in a Hollywood movie. And some of these movies are big budgeted and mainstream movies in Korea, and you could never make a mainstream movie like that here, where someone has his Achilles tendon very, very visibly on screen sliced open by someone, or or have their heads cut off, or faces bashed in, just as not as like a torture porn, but as a cathartic moment of just like horrible violence. It's not that it's just violent all the time, like a Hostel or a Saw. It comes in moments, and it's played for shock effect, but in a good way. It's not meant to just be this kind of festival of gore. And there's a place for that, I think, like in horror and those kind of realms. But in movies like this, it's more about like a build-up. It builds up and builds and builds and builds, and then it explodes in this like rage of violence, and then it has like a horribly violent moment that really kind of contributes to the power of that moment. There's someone, his wife was murdered by a serial killer, and he's searching for this guy, and the pain that he goes through and the rage that he feels for this person, and you see what a piece of shit this person is, and you see that he really deserves something horrible to happen. And then when it does, they don't shy away from actually showing you the horribleness of it. And I think it really gives it sort of strength. And it's something sort of unique. It's something that you're not used to seeing in media made here, which makes it very interesting. Anime, as I said, and Japanese cinema as a whole, science fiction has a lot of interesting angles to it. Deals sometimes with topics that are a little different, especially in Japan. If you look at something like Akira, if you look at something like Ghost in the Shell, or even Psychopaths, Japan has Japan has different baggage than the United States has, especially with regards to World War II, and that finds up a big place in its media, especially its speculative fiction, science fiction. Japan had a very stark cultural change after World War II. The Japan of today is incredibly different from the Japan of 100 years ago. And a lot of it comes from that, this sort of break into, and I'm sorry if some of the stuff that I say here is non-scholarly. This is just the way that I interpret things as a consumer of media. I'm not a scholar of this topic. There certainly are scholars in this topic, but it seems to me that a lot of it deals with the transition from being less of an individualistic society to a very individualistic society, whereas like back in like Imperial Japan, like the simple citizenry was not very important. And now there's this sort of renewed, sort of modernized individualism, and that finds expression, I see, in a lot of that. For instance, there's a pretty common trope where, everyone in the world gets kind of infected with some kind of disease, and that disease manifests itself as different superpowers for each person, and then each person's unique power then comes in handy, so the team has to come together to solve something, and that's that kind of like physical manifestation of individualism is very common there, and very interesting, and like I said, probably someone who's studied this could say more and even maybe contradict what I'm saying, but as an outside observer, seems to be pushing this idea that everyone's unique abilities are important and could come in handy, and that nobody is just an unimportant drone that doesn't have anything that's special about them. This whole idea that everybody is special And that's pretty interesting. So yeah, Japanese, Korean, and it extends beyond just Asia. Like for instance, Russia is another place that I think produces some interesting fiction. Russian cinema not as much, although the Night Watch films, which are based on a pretty good series of books, are pretty cool. It's kind of like Constantine meets Harry Potter, sort of. It's this sort of gritty world of wizards and demons and stuff, and it's in modern day Moscow. The books are really cool. The movies are pretty cool too, and they're slightly closer to like a Western perspective on things, but it's their voice is very Russian, and obviously there's a long-standing tradition of Russian science fiction. Isaac Asimov and also personal favorites of mine, the Strugatsky brothers, who wrote a bunch of novels, including Roadside Picnic, which is a classic in my opinion. And yeah, not as different as, say, something from China or Japan, but very Russian in its voice and in its attitude. And I really do sort of recommend. I recommend consuming stuff like that because I'm always on the lookout for stuff that's nothing like I've ever seen. I'm always trying to find movies and books and shows that have a unique voice, and obviously there's always more unique voices to be found here. But I always find that foreign countries are gold mine of that stuff, because people there who make movies and people there who write books, they come out of a completely different sort of environment. Here, most creators, most directors are people who, went to film school, shot some kind of student film, or maybe financed their own movie. This is obviously not universal, but it has this sort of common thread among creators and how they came about making their craft. And over there, and by there I mean anywhere, essentially, Europe or Asia, it can happen sometimes in very different ways. And even if it happens in the same way, it has a different attitude. Film school in Korea is probably not the same as film school in the United States. And the film industry in Korea is certainly not the same as the film industry in the United States. And that different process and that different history leads to some very different results. And I think that's really cool. And that's just about all I have to say about this. I mean, this is just a very long-winded way of saying, like, go out and find interesting stuff that's being made in other countries. I know good science fiction that comes from like Sweden and Spain and as I said, Russia, Asian countries, even District 9, which came out of South Africa. Different voices, interesting perspectives on things. So that's just about it for this week's Neoncast. I just once again wanted to really thank everyone for their comments, and keep sending me tweets at Neon Taster. Keep commenting. I would love to hear anything that maybe people would want me to discuss. I know I ramble about lots of stuff like on Twitter and message boards, and I know some people here who listen to this have also read a bunch of stuff I've written in the past. So maybe if you wanted me to address any of that, I mean, there's some other stuff, but nothing important. I watched Jurassic World last night and thought it was just terrible. But I figured I would focus more on good things than bad here, even though I did spend the majority of last week's Neoncast bashing Avatar. I thought I did it in a not so much as like a ranty, ragey kind of way, like, oh, fuck this movie, it's so awful. It was more like me just being baffled at why it was done the way it was. And Jurassic World, I would not be able to do that with Jurassic World. It would be mostly like, what the fuck? This dialogue is so douchey and it's just unimpressive and whatever. Like I wouldn't be able to attack it from a point of like deep love. I mean, I love Jurassic Park, but it's not like I'm sort of deeply embedded in this world enough to be able to lovingly dissect a movie that's this bland and terrible. So anyway, at Neon Taster, comment on this, share it, subscribe to it, or don't. Thanks for listening, if you have been listening. And if not, why am I talking to you?